Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The house smelled like cinnamon, roasted turkey, and tension. Melissa had spent the entire morning fluttering from stovetop to oven, brushing her hands across her jeans, pacing between the counter and the table with the kind of nervous energy you only get when your mother's coming over. She had set the table with the good china, white porcelain with little blue leaves around the edges, passed down from Lorraine's grandmother, who probably scolded people just as fiercely from beyond the grave. It was my third Thanksgiving married into the family, though it felt more like my 30th round of emotional dodgeball. Lorraine had this uncanny ability to make every gathering feel like a formal inquisition disguised as a dinner party. She'd start with questions that sounded innocent enough, still teaching middle school, Sam, but they'd land like little darts, each dipped in a healthy dose of judgment. Her voice always rode this tightrope between polite and poisonous, like she was smiling through clenched teeth, and everyone just accepted that as her personality. Melissa used to defend her, saying things like, "She's just old-fashioned," or "That's just how she talks," as if tone-deaf cruelty was a generational quirk, like quilting or chain-smoking. And every time, I'd swallow it. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. I cared enough to keep my mouth shut. I cared enough to show up. This year, we hosted dinner at our place for the first time. Small home, modest dining room, but Melissa had pulled every inch of herself into making it beautiful. There was garland across the fireplace, little pumpkins on the mantel, and a Spotify playlist called Cozy Thanksgiving Vibes humming in the background. Her dad, John, arrived first, quiet guy, never involved in the drama, unless you count nodding in disappointment as participation. Lorraine came 15 minutes late, like always, wrapped in a camel-colored coat that looked like it cost more than our fridge. She kissed Melissa on both cheeks, then immediately scanned the room. She looked at me like I was part of the decor, unnecessary, slightly dusty, and definitely not her taste. Then she said, "You didn't overcook the turkey this year, did you?" And I felt Melissa's fingers clench around the carving knife, just a little too tight. We sat down to eat. There was stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and cranberry sauce shaped like the can it came out of because Lorraine insisted it be served that way. For 30 minutes, we talked about politics without saying anything, finances without revealing numbers, and family memories that sounded fonder than they really were. I mostly kept quiet, cutting my food slowly, answering when spoken to. Lorraine, on the other hand, was in rare form. Every few minutes, she'd toss a casual jab like she was serving hors d'oeuvres. "You know, Melissa was valedictorian in high school," she said, looking directly at me, back before she started making simpler choices. Her fork hovered in midair, and she gave this polite little laugh that made me want to shove a yam into her purse. I caught Melissa's eyes across the table. She looked tired. Tired of playing the buffer. Tired of pretending these dinners were anything but obligation. When dessert came out, I grabbed the pie pumpkin because Lorraine said anything else would be lowbrow and cut equal slices for everyone. I handed one to Melissa, then John, then finally to Lorraine. She paused, looked down at her plate, then said, "You really can't do anything right, can you? The crust's too thick. Just like everything else you do." I laughed. Not out loud, but inside, something cracked, something small and necessary. I kept my face calm, but I could feel the heat rise up the back of my neck. I stood to clear the plates, my way of keeping busy when things felt tight in my chest. That's when it happened. Lorraine set her fork down and looked straight at me, her lips pursed, eyes sharp like broken glass. The room quieted, the air stretched thin. Then she said it. "You'll never be family. No matter how hard you try. You're not one of us. You never will be." It landed hard. Not like a slap, but like being shoved into cold water. Sudden. Shocking. Melissa's fork hit her plate with a soft clink. John looked at his hands, like maybe if he studied them long enough, he could disappear into his skin. No one said a word. No one told her to stop. No one asked me if I was okay. I didn't say anything either. I just picked up the empty plates and carried them into the kitchen, stacking them gently in the sink. The water ran hot, and I stared at the bubbles like they might hold a better version of this night. One where someone defended me. One where Melissa stood up. She came in a few minutes later, red around the eyes but quiet. She didn't mean it, she whispered. But she did. And the worst part? Melissa knew it. And she still wanted to believe otherwise. We finished cleaning up together. Lorraine had gone by then, claiming she had somewhere better to be, which was the truest thing she'd said all evening. John followed her like a ghost, silent as ever. That night, Melissa curled into me in bed, her back warm against my chest, and said, "I'm sorry. But apologies don't erase scars. They just name them." I didn't sleep much. I stared at the ceiling fan as it spun slow, like time itself was dragging its feet. I kept replaying the dinner, each word Lorraine spat, echoing louder than the last. That was the last Thanksgiving I ever attended. But it wasn't the last one she ruined. You don't just marry a person, you marry their past, their weird family rituals, their outdated furniture, their passive-aggressive holiday traditions, and if you're really unlucky, you marry their mother too. When Melissa and I got engaged, I knew Lorraine wasn't thrilled. She didn't even try to hide it, just tightened her smile and said, "Well, I guess everyone gets one big mistake," like she was commenting on a burnt casserole and not the man her daughter had chosen to spend her life with. The first time I really felt the chill from her wasn't at some big dramatic showdown, but during a brunch at her country club, the kind of place where the napkins are folded like swans and the waiters call you sir no matter how much they hate you. Lorraine had invited us to celebrate Melissa's new job at the hospital. She'd just passed her boards, and I thought maybe, just maybe, Lorraine might soften. Instead, halfway through the overpriced Eggs Benedict, she turned to the woman sitting beside her, some acquaintance with a diamond the size of a grape, and said, "Melissa always had a thing for fixing broken things. Even as a child, she'd bring home stray cats and men." The table laughed, and I smiled, but I felt it like a stone in my gut. Melissa squeezed my knee under the table and gave me this look like, "Just let it go." That look became a habit between us. Every time Lorraine said something cruel dipped in sugar, Melissa would silently plead for peace, and I would swallow the bile in my throat because I loved her. That was year 1. By year 3, Lorraine had perfected the art of cutting me down without ever raising her voice. She'd accidentally forget my birthday, but send Melissa a card with a check every year without fail. She'd introduce me to friends as Melissa's husband, the one who teaches kids, I think, as if the word teacher was too pedestrian for her vocabulary. She once corrected my grammar at a dinner party in front of 6 people just because I said less instead of fewer, and followed it up with, "Oh, don't worry, Melissa can teach you proper English eventually." Every time I brought it up, Melissa would give me her usual defenses, "She's just particular," or "That's how she shows love." As if Lorraine was some misunderstood cartoon villain instead of a grown woman who knew exactly where to stab the knife and how deep to push it. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to be the reason Melissa fought with her mom. I told myself it was easier to play the long game. But silence has a way of curdling into resentment when left too long. There was this one family trip I'll never forget, not because anything terrible happened, but because it was the exact moment I realized just how little space Lorraine thought I deserved. We were driving through the mountains, taking a scenic route back from a wedding in West Virginia. I was behind the wheel, Melissa asleep beside me, and Lorraine in the back, pretending to read a book but really just watching the GPS like it owed her money. Somewhere around the border of Ohio and Kentucky, she leaned forward and said, "Are you sure you're taking the fastest route, Sam? We've been in the car for almost 3 hours, and I swear we've only crossed 4 states. 4 states in 3 hours. Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky." That's what she said. I nodded, said nothing, and kept driving. But I remember thinking, does she even hear herself? It wasn't just that she was wrong. It was the arrogance in how confidently she was wrong. The assumption that I didn't know what I was doing simply because I was me. And that assumption carried into everything. Whether it was fixing the sink, picking a restaurant, booking flights, or even choosing wine, Lorraine always found a way to suggest I had chosen poorly. It became a game she played, and the family just watched. Melissa, God love her, tried to bridge the gap. She'd defend me in private, apologize on behalf of her mother when the damage was already done, but she never stood up to her face. I think part of her was afraid of becoming the next target. Still, I endured. I went to the birthday parties, the Christmas dinners, the 4th of July cookouts at her lakeside property where the grill was bigger than my first apartment. I laughed when I needed to. I smiled for the camera. I played nice. I figured one day, maybe she'd see I wasn't the villain in her imagined screenplay. But that day never came. Because Lorraine didn't want to accept me. She wanted to win. She wanted Melissa to know that love came with conditions, and marrying me was a penalty she'd pay forever. It wasn't just about me. That's what made it worse. She did it to everyone who didn't fit neatly into her little world of crystal vases, wine tastings, and people who said pardon instead of what. If someone couldn't offer her a transaction, status, influence, money, they were beneath her. And I wasn't the only one who saw it. I started to notice how her friends dropped off, how neighbors avoided her, how the waitress at her favorite restaurant flinched every time she opened her mouth. But the real turning point wasn't something she said. It was what she did to someone else. It was one of those overcast mornings that clung to your skin like wet flannel, the sky sitting low and gray like it had something to say but didn't know how to say it. Lorraine had asked me to help move a few boxes from her garage that day, not because she couldn't do it herself, but because asking me to do menial things seemed to be her favorite form of communication. I was already knee-deep in cardboard labeled seasonal, do not touch, when I heard the sound. At first, it was soft, like a bird caught in a screen door, but then it grew sharper, a strained, gasping sort of noise that made me freeze mid-step. It came from the house next door. Lorraine's neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone kept their lawns trimmed within regulation height and waved to each other with teeth instead of warmth. Her neighbor, Ruth, had lived there longer than most of the driveways had been poured. A retired nurse in her late 70s, Ruth was one of the few people on that street who seemed genuinely kind, even if time had stolen a bit of her memory and a good chunk of her energy. She always wore a faded yellow cardigan, even in summer, and her voice trembled slightly like it had learned too much and was tired of speaking. When I walked to the edge of Lorraine's yard and looked across the hedge, I saw her. Ruth was collapsed on her front steps, one slipper halfway off. A newspaper sprawled beside her like a white flag. She was trying to speak but couldn't get the words out. Her hands fluttered uselessly against the concrete. I called out Lorraine. As I ran past her begonias, nearly tripping over the damn decorative gnome by her mailbox. Lorraine stepped out of the garage with a coffee mug in hand, sipping slowly, eyes following me like I was doing something suspicious instead of trying to help a woman in distress. "She's on the ground," I shouted, dialing 911 as I crouched beside Ruth. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin had the pale blue tint that screams not enough oxygen. "Call the gate. Tell them to let the ambulance in fast," I yelled back at Lorraine. She didn't move. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she took another sip and said flatly, "I'm not a caretaker, Sam. That's not my job." I remember the pause more than the words themselves. That moment where my brain struggled to catch up, to register if I'd heard her right. Ruth, who once brought over a lemon pound cake when Lorraine's husband passed, who fed Lorraine's cat for a week when she went to Martha's Vineyard, was lying inches from death, and Lorraine couldn't be bothered to step out of her driveway. The paramedics arrived within minutes, bless them for knowing their way through gated hell, and they managed to stabilize Ruth on the scene. She was taken to the hospital, diagnosed with a mild heart attack, and kept overnight. Melissa and I visited her the next day, brought her flowers and crossword puzzles, even though she kept apologizing for making such a fuss. That's the kind of person she was. Ashamed for being vulnerable. Embarrassed for being seen. What haunted me most wasn't Lorraine's refusal to help, or even the way she watched from her porch with that goddamn coffee like she was observing a street performance. What haunted me was what she said later at dinner, when John asked how Ruth was doing. "She's fine," Lorraine had said with a shrug, probably faking it for attention. She was always a bit dramatic. No one called her out. Not John, not Melissa, not even the cousin who once claimed to be an EMT but couldn't locate the spleen on a diagram. Everyone just let it slide, like it was just another one of her throwaway lines. But it stuck in my throat like a shard of glass. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying it, her tone, her face, the complete absence of empathy. It was like watching a mirror fog over and suddenly realizing there had never been a reflection behind it in the first place. I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, the glow from the fridge the only light in the house, and I opened my laptop. I created a new folder. I didn't name it something obvious like Lorraine's bullshit or in-law insanity. I gave it the one word that tied every injury together, the moment that started it all. I called it Thanksgiving. Inside that folder, I began collecting everything. Notes about things she said, screenshots of texts she accidentally sent to me instead of Melissa, photos of empty birthday cards, videos from family dinners where she'd corner me with her saccharine venom. I didn't have a plan yet. I didn't know what I was building. But I knew I had to build something, because this woman wasn't just cruel. She was dangerous in the way only the rich and charming can be, because no one ever holds them accountable. And that's when I started the folder. Password protected. Titled, Thanksgiving. There are moments in a marriage that don't scream or announce themselves with drama, but they still split everything right down the middle like a hairline fracture in glass, quiet, sharp, and irreversible. The night I showed Melissa the folder was one of those moments, and even as I sat across from her on the couch, laptop open on the coffee table between us, my stomach tightening with every scroll, I knew there would be no going back to how things used to be. Not because of what Lorraine had done, God knows she'd been awful from day one, but because Melissa was going to have to see her mother clearly for the first time, and clarity like that tends to ruin all kinds of illusions. It started simple, with the screenshots. I showed her messages Lorraine had sent behind her back, one where she told Melissa's cousin that I was probably lying about his student loans so he could mooch longer, and another where she flat out accused me of probably being gay and using Melissa as a beard, because apparently teaching literature to 8th graders wasn't masculine enough for her warped, gold-plated standards. I kept my voice low as I walked Melissa through it, not because I wasn't angry, believe me, I was, but because I could feel the foundation under us cracking, and shouting over it wouldn't stop the collapse. Melissa didn't speak for a long time. She just stared at the screen, her hand slowly covering her mouth like she was trying to hold something in grief, shame, maybe a scream. She scrolled through the photos I'd saved, Lorraine smiling politely while whispering something nasty behind my back, Lorraine writing to my daughter and her partner on a Christmas card like she couldn't bring herself to say my name. But the real hit, the one that knocked the wind out of her, came with the documents. I had found a credit card statement a few months earlier while going through some mail Lorraine had accidentally sent to our house. At first, I assumed it was just junk until I saw Melissa's full name on the account. Not Lorraine's. Melissa's. With purchases dating back nearly 2 years. Jewelry stores, salon visits, airline tickets, all under a card she didn't even know existed. Lorraine had opened it using Melissa's social security number, probably swiped from some old tax forms when she still handled the family's finances. Fraud. Plain and simple. Dressed up in pearls and denial. When I slid the papers in front of her, Melissa didn't cry. She went completely still, like her body had gone offline just to keep her heart from short-circuiting. "She used my name," she asked, voice flat, eyes dull. I nodded. "She's been using it. For years. And I can guarantee she's not sorry." The confrontation happened the next morning. Lorraine came over for brunch like she hadn't spent the last decade slowly rotting the floorboards of our relationship from the inside. Melissa didn't even let her sit down. She held up the statement, shaking slightly, and said, "What the hell is this?" Lorraine barely blinked. She looked at the paper like it was a minor inconvenience, like a receipt she meant to toss out. Then came the performance. "I only did that because I didn't want to bother you for help," she said, wrapping her words in that soft, martyr-like tone she used when trying to avoid consequences. "And besides, you're always so generous with your money. You married a man who lets you split rent, for God's sake." I watched the moment it happened, Melissa's grip on the truth slipping through her fingers, her need to believe her mother hadn't betrayed her wrestling with the evidence in her hands. She tried to argue. "You committed fraud, Mom. You stole from me." But Lorraine, ever the manipulator, tilted her head and said, "Don't turn this into some crusade against me just because your husband has a grudge. You know how sensitive he is." And just like that, Melissa froze. Not because she agreed with her mother, no, not deep down. But because choosing me over her meant more than just loyalty. It meant losing the idea of the woman who raised her, meant pulling down the curtain and admitting there was no wizard behind it, only a bitter woman pulling strings made of guilt. She didn't cut her off. Not then. Not after. She said she needed time. She said she was overwhelmed. She said all the things people say when they don't want to face the abyss staring back at them. And I couldn't blame her. But I also couldn't stay. I packed a bag that night and moved into a cheap Airbnb near the school where I taught. It was small, smelled like someone else's leftovers, and the bed squeaked when I breathed too hard, but it was quiet. And it gave me time to think. Time to ask myself if staying in this marriage meant signing up for a lifetime of dodging Lorraine's verbal landmines and waiting for Melissa to finally set the boundary that should have been drawn years ago. Every night, I'd sit in that room and look at the folder again. I'd add new entries, notes, reflections, things I remembered from years ago but hadn't processed until now. It was growing into something bigger than a grudge. It was a case file. Not just for me, but for the truth. People always ask, why stay? Why not just walk away? And I get it. I do. There's something pathetic about a man chasing justice through screenshots and spreadsheets while the world keeps spinning. But this wasn't just about pride. This was about finally standing up in a way I never had. Not with fists or shouting matches, but with proof. With something Lorraine couldn't gaslight away or smooth over with her Sunday brunch smile. A few weeks passed. Melissa called, asked me to come home. Said she was ready to talk. Ready to face it. Maybe she meant it. Maybe she didn't. Either way, I agreed. But this time, it wasn't about reconciliation or hope or love reborn in the ashes. I moved back in. But I wasn't moving back for her. I was moving back to finish what I started. There's something almost sacred about revenge when it's done slow, quiet, and without theatrics, the kind that doesn't need shouting or fists or some big explosive finale. Just a steady hand and time, the kind of time most people don't have the patience for. But I had patience. I had a decade's worth of quiet humiliation bottled inside me like something toxic, and every year, every birthday forgotten, every smirk Lorraine gave me across a dinner table, every time she called me that man instead of saying my name. Each one was a drop in the barrel, and when it finally overflowed, I didn't scream. I planned. After I moved back in with Melissa, things didn't exactly go back to normal, but they settled into this cold sort of routine, like two people trying to walk across cracked ice without making it shudder. She was different now, less hopeful, more quiet, more aware of how deep the rot went in the family tree. But she still visited her mother once a week. Still answered her calls. Still tried to pretend there was something worth salvaging. I didn't argue with her. I just observed. I had already started the process months before I ever showed her the folder. Back when Ruth collapsed on those concrete steps and Lorraine shrugged her off like roadkill, I started digging into public records. It was a stupid impulse at first, like checking the value of your old baseball cards just to see if they were worth anything. I searched Lorraine's name. I found the deed. I found the bank. And I found out her house, her precious beige palace in that prim little neighborhood, was mortgaged deeper than she ever let on. That shocked me. Not because she'd lied, lying was her second language, but because it meant she was vulnerable, financially at least. Turns out her husband left her the property, but not the means to maintain it, and Lorraine, too proud to sell, took out loans she couldn't quite cover. Maintenance. Property tax. The koi pond she had installed for no reason other than to brag. It added up. Slowly, but definitely. So I called a guy. A friend of a friend who used to flip properties in foreclosure. We set up an LLC, one of those shell companies with a name that sounds like it manufactures dental floss or manages pension funds. Through that shell, I made the offer to buy her mortgage. It wasn't cheap, but it was doable. I liquidated an old retirement account, dipped into savings, sold a few stocks I barely remembered buying. Melissa never knew. Lorraine certainly didn't. That was the beauty of it. She was still judging my salary while I was buying the ground beneath her house. Months passed. Lorraine didn't pay a few bills. Maybe she thought the bank would keep tolerating her. Or maybe she assumed John would bail her out again like he always did. Either way, she missed too many payments, and the LLC stepped in, quiet as a whisper. We bought her debt. We waited the appropriate grace period. Then, the letter went out. Official. Cold. Standard issue language. You are hereby notified. Melissa didn't know until the very end. I didn't want her involved. Didn't want her name tangled in it. This wasn't about her. This was about me and Lorraine and every table I cleared in silence while she sharpened her words into blades. The day Lorraine packed her boxes was rainy in that slow, soaking way that makes everything feel heavier than it is. I parked down the street, out of sight, and walked up the driveway with a pie in my hands. Pumpkin. Store-bought crust. Nothing fancy. She was alone. John had long since left her to fend for herself, emotionally and otherwise. A few movers shuffled around the house, disassembling the skeleton of a life built on control and appearances. I stepped through the open front door like a ghost returning to the place he died. She turned and saw me standing there with the pie, and for the first time in our entire history, she didn't fake a smile or reach for a cutting remark. She just stared. I brought dessert, I said, offering it gently. Pumpkin. You always said mine was bland. Thought maybe you'd like this one. It's from the place you used to pretend was beneath you. She didn't take the pie. She didn't ask questions. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You did this." It wasn't a question. It was a fact. I shrugged, letting the silence between us fill in everything she wanted to yell. "You did this," I echoed, voice lower, slower. 10 years ago, at that table. You said I'd never be family. And you were right. I never was. But now neither are you. Her lips curled, not in a smile but in something bitterer, like she'd just tasted something rotten and couldn't spit it out. She stepped closer, not with fear, but with the same twisted pride that had carried her through life like a shield. "You'll never stop being small," she whispered, not with anger, but certainty. And maybe she was right. Maybe this was small. Maybe buying a house out from under an old woman because she mocked me one too many times was petty and vengeful and beneath the man I once tried to be. But I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I just set the pie on the marble kitchen counter, the one she used to clean with imported Italian polish, and turned to leave. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said over my shoulder. "Hope the crust's thick enough for you." She never screamed. Never chased me down. Never begged for anything. She just stood there, in that hollow house, surrounded by boxes she thought she'd never have to pack, watching the one person she'd underestimated more than anyone else walk out her front door without looking back. And maybe she's right. Maybe I'll never stop being small. But at least I'm free.